In today's show, we discuss one of our Dynamite Conspiracy episodes, where we say, are any of these conspiracies true? Chemtrails, are they nefarious or just something ordinary? JFK assassination, what happened there? And the death of Pope John Paul I, was he assassinated?
And now, the TNT Talk Show, daring to go where other podcasts fear to tread.
Hello, I'm Tony Fasula and I share the stage with my esteemed friend and colleague, Tayo Boyer. Tayo, hello, my friend. I hope you're keeping safe and well.
Yeah, what the hell?
Oh dear, I don't know what our audience think of you.
Well, they don't say hello to me, I don't say hello to them. Never mind.
I'm going to say hello. Hello, audience. Welcome back to another craziness show.
Yeah,
and yeah, today's show, we again discuss our popular theme that we introduced a little while ago called Dynamic Conspiracies. And we ask whether the few conspiracies, hopefully we've got time permitting, that we're going to discuss are actually true. And our first discussion is chemtrails. Tayo, do you want to kick things off and to explain to our audience what the heck they are and why they're a conspiracy?
Well, chemtrails are those white lines, trails you see in the sky, clear blue skies, when an airplane, I think specifically it has to be a jet airplane, but it might also be prop jobs. We don't see that many high altitude propeller jobs nowadays, I suppose. But if you think of your typical classical jet aircraft, especially a passenger airliner, flying high overhead on a clear day, you very often see trails following the jet. And starting from, I believe it was 1996, I think, the Pentagon released a white paper in which they suggested that they ought to look into how to deal with the weather in such a way that they could use it for military purposes. And they could, I think it's suggested trailing something out of an aircraft or a few aircraft in such a way that the weather was affected and it conferred military benefit to the American armed forces. This, to me, is the root, because nobody thought about chemtrails before then, and I think the root took root. This conspiracy took root from that, and was further buttressed by the Olympics of Beijing. Was that in 2000? I forget now.
Yeah,
the,
where they
the
had...
Beijing Olympics, where the Chinese government seeded using, what is it, silver iodide?
Yeah,
they seeded clouds in provinces surrounding Beijing in order to make the clouds rain, basically, which then dehydrated the area, dried up the area, and in that way guaranteed dry games.
Yeah,
which was, kind of clever.
But the thing is,
if not a bit cynical.
but isn't this though a standard process now? They actually do this around the world in areas. So it's not conspiracy, is it?
This bit of it isn't conspiracy. This bit of it is well known and understood. Some people think you should be messing with nature. But for instance, in parts of the American Midwest where they routinely suffer from violent and dangerous storms, they seed these storm cells early on to weaken them and to make life easier and less dangerous. So that's actually a positive outcome, and I don't think anybody would say that that's wrong. I mean,
no.
Anyway, so I don't know exactly what happened. So a woman whose name I forget now, she was the first to raise this issue, this concept of the chemtrails containing more than water vapor. Because actually, they're not I mean, if they contain chemicals which are injurious to humans, you'd call them chemtrails. But the old water vapor trails were actually called contrails. And I grew up with something called CON.
Yes,
contrails.
that's right.
Just
That's
condensation trails. That's all. That's all they were.
Yeah, yeah.
And some people say, "Oh, there were no contrails or chemtrails, back in the day." Rubbish. As a small child, I used to look up and see that. Absolute nonsense. They've been around since forever. So we've got pictures going back to the Second World War, I think, of all those bombers flying, off to. So actually, yes, they do come from propellers as well as jets. They were flying off to war, and they were leaving these trails and condensation trails in the sky. So absolute claptrap from that point of view. And then you had famous people like Prince come along and say that there's a strong correlation, in his mind at any rate, between violence, between intra-communal violence, and the rise of these so-called chemtrails in the sky.
Yeah.
Other people have suggested governments want to depopulate the old depopulation theory, which you and I have met many times now.
Yep.
And so on and so forth. What I'm hoping that you can do is what I wasn't able to do, is to find any evidence whatsoever to back any of these claims up.
No, there aren't any. This is the thing. What? Okay, I will change my tune on that actually. But there were a number of tests done by independent scientists. But again, the conspiracy people are looking at those scientists, say, "Oh yeah, they must have some ulterior government motive to toe the party line, so to speak." And so they found no evidence of any atmospheric control mechanism, because they rightly pointed out at that height, if there was any real way of, how can I put it, trying to control the population by putting chemicals in the sky, they would need a load more than what's up there. A load more, because the way that the wind blows, it disperses. So the chances of using that method to actually affect the population on the ground, it's not a very good, efficient method of doing it. You'd have to fly far lower to ensure that whatever you're producing out the back of the plane was not blown away or diluted by the atmosphere itself and lands in the place you expect it to land. At the heights that these planes are flying at, by the time it would land on the ground, it would be so dispersed, it would make no difference anyway. So whether or not it had the intended, well, if that was the reason they were trying to do these things, they were trying to intend to control population, spread all this sort of stuff, it seems far-fetched. Let's put it that way. They would have to do it at a much lower flight path, literally a few hundred feet, not thousands of feet in the sky, because the items, by virtue of them coming out of the back of a plane, are very, very thin, very, very small. So if they were, some conspiracy to affect the population by letting them come out of the air, it would have to be done lower. It would be like a crop farmer having to do it. Now they fly those little monoplanes, they go over farms, and they do it at a relatively low height because of that reason. Because if they go too high, it gets dispersed by the wind and hasn't the effect that they expect it to have. So the height that the jets are flying, it's very unlikely that they would be seeding something other than trying to affect the weather. Now, if that's what people are moaning about, oh, they shouldn't be messing with the weather, then yes, that is true. They could be messing with the weather at that high altitude, because actually affecting the population on the ground, that is far-fetched. They're just too big a gap. and the produce, if that was the reason for their doing it, would be dispersed in the atmosphere, in the air, in the wind, the currents. It would be useless.
Yes, I don't know how high military aircraft, which are going to bomb using which are going to disperse chemical or biological warfare, have to fly. But I'd have thought it's not very high because they tend not to use jets, they tend to use helicopters.
Yeah.
And that would suggest that they're flying far closer to the ground. And there must be a reason for that. Furthermore, unless there are really powerful antidotes which are readily available to the people in power, I don't think anyone in government would be really happy to know that these jets flying overhead are spreading dangerous chemicals and to be quite sanguine about it. So you don't catch Boris Johnson looking up nervously into the sky because he's got chemtrails on his mind. You don't find anyone doing that. They all seem to. So, is there another secret program where these people are all being inoculated? And at what point in time do they get inoculated? If anyone can run for parliament and or presumably become an MP, rise through government, at what stage do they get pulled aside and told, look, man, we've been gassing you and your kids and your family for the past 20 years, but here's an inoculation. Shh, don't tell anyone.
Yeah, I
it's
know,
absolute.
I know.
It's pants, man. It doesn't make any sense.
It's too hit and miss. Now, I'm going to put a caveat here for our conspiracy listeners, right? I'm not saying, however, that chemical bits, how can I put it? Chemical bits haven't been released from planes to affect a small area. I'm not saying that, because you could possibly, and I bet there's examples of it, where certain military areas have released chemicals from planes. They have, but they haven't done it at the heights that the chemtrails actually are in the sky. It's just too high up. It really is. So those people who may have a beef and say, well, yeah, they're doing military experiments, they're releasing chemicals from planes. Yes, I think you could be right, but they're not the chemtrails. This is what I'm saying. They would be released at a much lower altitude to ensure they're hitting an area or demographic in the appropriate manner. Otherwise, it's too high. It's too hit and miss. You are risking it spreading way larger areas than was required if that was their aim. So to me, that is totally far-fetched, where the chemtrails, or the, as you rightly say, the contrails from an aeroplane, a jet plane, is exactly that. It's just water vapor. And the way that it's high up in the sky means that they stay in the sky for a while. It's not a strange phenomenon. It's because the atmosphere is so thin up there, they do last longer. But there's no nastiness up there. There's no reason for it to be of a fear factor and, oh, look, those chemtrails are going to be affecting us. No, that isn't the case.
And when you think about the logistics of it, it's like some woman was telling me that she didn't believe that there's such a thing as a COVID virus, a coronavirus, and it's never been isolated in the lab.
What?
And, well, that's what she told me.
Oh.
And I said, well, I don't know, but if that's true, think of the number of people who've had to lie to us. Yeah. Every world leader, the heads of ministries of health, scientists, doctors, including, by the way, local doctors.
Yeah, I know.
The people who treated me when I went into hospital last year for COVID, they had to have lied about it too. The lab technicians had to have lied about it too. It beggars belief. It's actually a very stupid thing to say, because you are asking. There's this proverb. I don't know how ancient it is. There's a proverb. No, it's not a proverb. It's a saying. It's a saying. I don't know how ancient it is. They're saying, it says, how do you keep a secret is don't tell anyone else. Because two people know it's no longer a secret.
Yeah.
It's just that's it. And here you're saying that millions of people know, and they've been able to keep the secret. It's ridiculous. And in that sense, you can look at situations like the one we're talking about now, the chemtrails and the contrails, and you can start asking yourself, who would have to know about this? So wherever they're mixing those chemicals, all the people in that factory would have to know and keep quiet. They don't have to go into the fuel trucks for the aircraft, and those people have to keep quiet. The government officials all over the world would have to keep quiet, and not just keep quiet, be inoculated, as I mentioned before. Not because I don't think they'd expose themselves to harm on purpose. And whoever is doing the inoculation would have to keep quiet. And chemtrails are seen all over the world, not just seen over America or over the UK. You see them in Russia, China, places, even, I suppose, North Korea. Now, if you are in a position to fly over North Korea and depopulate their population, wouldn't you put a little bit something extra into it just to like, you know what, you guys are a real problem, man. I'm very sorry. It's ridiculous. It's fantastical and silly. I think we can write that one off as being.
I'm agreeing with you, because as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And there is no proof for this at all. But I must stress again, for our conspiracy believers who still think, oh no, chemtrails are... No, I'm not saying that biowarfare or things haven't been ejected from planes. I must stress that, because there is examples of the military doing this. They've done it in the past. However, they've done it at very low altitudes. They have to.
Agent Orange in Vietnam.
Yes, they've had to. They've literally had to fly a little above the treetops in order to ensure that whatever it is they're releasing is getting down to the ground without being dispersed and what's the word, where it becomes less, it's no longer worthy, it's too weak because it's been dispersed in the atmosphere. And chemtrails, by their very nature, or contrails, the right word, they're just too high up. They're too high up. So it would be pointless to do anything at that level unless you are actually trying to affect the weather, which is a known process, and it has been done, but in the examples that you've already given us, Tayo, which is correct, to avert a potential major storm or try and affect a rain that could damage and hurt people. So it's done in the proper way, in the correct manner. And it's a practice that is done around the world in order to prevent major storms or anything like that from occurring and actually affecting the population. Because actually, going on this same subject, do you remember Chernobyl?
Yeah.
There was a huge radiation cloud heading towards the Soviet Union after the disaster.
And they had in the Soviet Union, so it kind of been heading towards it.
Well, it was in Ukraine, wasn't it, where Chernobyl was? So sorry, heading for Russia. My apologies.
There we go.
Yeah, it was.
Hang on, no, you're right. Because Ukraine,
at the time, was
Ukraine part of the USSR?
It was, yeah.
It was, yeah. So it was already in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. So, heading towards Russia itself.
Right, Mother Russia.
It was heading towards a major population area. Ooh. And in order for it not to get there and cause even bigger problems, they had to seed the clouds to ensure that the rain would come down on this radiation and force it to the ground. So a large area of Ukraine was affected because the rain pushed this downwards, but it averted it heading towards parts of Russia which were heavily populated, which would have caused more deaths. So they did do that.
Keep Russia safe.
Well, no. I mean, at the time it was the USSR.
No, I'm saying keep Russia safe. President Putin has done fantastic things.
That's a talk for another day.
And there's still our bulwark against Western identity politics. So I tip my hat to the man.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. We've done that one. I think we're pretty much secure. Your final opinion is on chemtrails?
Load of rubbish.
Okay. It is just a conspiracy, and there's no evidence, any meaningful evidence to say the actual chemtrails are what people say they are. They are just water vapor. But like I said, I will caveat again, it's not saying that things haven't been dispersed from planes, because they have, but at much lower levels, at lower heights. My apologies. Right, let's move on. Let's move on to our next topic on this conspiracy program. And the second one we want to discuss is quite a controversial one even today. It was in the early 60s. It was indeed the JFK assassination. And yes, this is a biggie, because obviously this was witnessed by many, many people, where John F. Kennedy, the current president at the time, was assassinated in Texas by, was purported, a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. Taya, what's your thoughts on this particular
This is one of the very, very few conspiracies that I actually believe. Is there something there? Apart from the fact of the magic bullet, which is a bullet which, in order to have done the damage that is claimed the bullet did, it had to have reversed in midair. And I don't know how anybody can actually seriously purport that this is the case in public. How do you keep a straight face and say in public, it did this and it did that? Because that's why it's called the magic bullet. It just didn't act like a proper bullet should. Then the timelines given for Lee Harvey Oswald's movements, his ability to, of anyone, by the way, I think a few episodes ago, you were telling me about experiments they carried out, and no marksman was able to recreate the shots from where Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly
supposed to have been,
was supposed to have been, and to have fired his weapon. Then you have Jack Ruby, who took it upon himself to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, but why? For reasons which are completely beyond comprehension. Why did he have a personal beef in it? And he was a mafia man anyway.
He was. Yeah.
It was not as if he was in great love with the establishment or anything. So he wasn't a staunch Democrat, or there's just no reason. Why did he do that?
Yeah.
And of course, he was dying of cancer at the time, so he already knew. And to me, that's very, very much like somebody set him off in return for favors. And I would like to know what happened to his family.
I would as well, because there doesn't seem to be any record of what Jack Ruby's family.
I wouldn't be surprised if the family mysteriously came into quite a lot of money afterwards.
See, that's unknown. I don't know the details. No, I'm with you as well. Actually, this one is the one where the official explanation, because they actually commissioned a Warren Commission, which was supposed to be a commission that was set up afterwards, because the original line was that that JFK was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the lone gunman. He fired the shots, of which they originally said there were 3 shots, but then subsequently, what was later discovered, it was actually 4. And there was no way that, from Lee Harvey Oswald's viewpoint, in the building that he was allegedly claimed to have been firing from, there was no way he could have got 4 shots from the weapon he used in the time frame before the car was out of line. It was just physically not possible. But there were 4 shots. It was out of sight. He just couldn't have done it. So, there is arguments that there was a second shooter. If Lee Harvey Oswald actually did shoot, he didn't kill the president. He didn't actually shoot the fatal shot. The 4th shot seemed to indicate that was the one that actually killed the president. And that was caught on camera by a very famous film called the Zapruder film. And this was actually, the Zapruder film was a film that was actually recorded by a gentleman called Abraham Zapruder. And obviously, so many people were watching this ceremony and this cavalcade coming past. And he was at the point, it was a silent film, he was at the bit, and he captured the moment of the shooting. And this film was only provided afterwards, that showed that there was an extra bullet that came through. And so this
the direction of the bullets, you see, the big thing about it, for anybody who wants to watch the Assassination again, it's a pretty grisly,
it's horrible
piece of film. But if you watch carefully, it's just obvious. The president is struck, I think, twice. And he jerks forward because the bullets are coming from behind him. But the one shot, and those shots, by the way, I think they enter his body and they don't strike the head at all.
No,
I'm not really 100% sure.
It's chest and neck area, I believe.
Right, chest and neck. So he's pushed forward by the force of the bullet. But then he is slammed back violently with a shot from the front. And that's the magic bullet. that's the one that came from behind, but somehow turned in midair and then hit him from the front, which is ridiculous. And then the back of his head, sorry to put it like this, audience, back of his head exploded. And that's not how bullets work, man. For goodness sakes. And when we talk about the Warren Commission and everything, you do know that one of the people who was implicated in the assassination, possibly not directly, possibly indirectly, was Vice President Johnson, who then became President Johnson.
Yes.
And
he was sworn in just a few hours later.
Yes, well, that's normal, I think. Someone else has to be at the head of the...
Yeah, but Jackie Kennedy, who was JF Kennedy's wife, was there. She still had stains on her jacket from her husband's blood.
I'm not taking that as anything, because in those days, there was a lot of tension with the Soviet Union. It could have been an assassination organized by the Soviet Union as a part of a preemptive strike. So I think a lot of people would have been very worried. Let's get a hold of the nuclear button, make sure that nuclear briefcase, make sure that we're ready to respond to anything if the Soviets start anything. And it took a while for the Soviets to get on the blower and to say, hey, that had nothing to do with us.
Yeah, nothing to do with us.
It wasn't us, and so on and so forth. So that bit I understand. But some conspiracy theories feel that he wasn't directly aware of the assassination, but that he was glad, if you like, that it had happened and didn't want to get too deep into who might have done it. Because he had a pretty good idea of who did it and why.
Really?
Well, this is the conspiracy. So I don't think anybody's actually saying that he was involved, but they are saying that
he was aware that they were
aware of it. And
but then again,
they went straight into Vietnam and did all the things they wanted to do, which JFK had stopped them from doing.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that bit. I know.
Yes. Without the assassination of JFK, we probably wouldn't have had a Vietnam War. So the same military-industrial complex that people have been warning us about since forever, they benefited from in no end. They benefited in no end from the death of JFK.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of organizations benefited from his death. So it wasn't just the military. And
you want to go on to give some examples?
Well, I know that there was more money funneled to all the big organizations after his death.
Well, sorry, that is too nebulous for me.
Okay. Well, I have
black and white. It's many years ago.
I remember reading something. I wish I'd kept it now. That said that who benefited, and there was a number of organizations. Because I mean, let's be honest, there was a lot of every president gets death threats. Every president, because they're not going to please anybody. That's the point of being a president. You've got to make decisions that benefit the country as a whole. And obviously, there's going to be certain individuals and organizations, whoever they may be, are not happy with some of the decisions. But in this case, JFK was going to make a lot of changes. I mean, he was directly going to impact the mafia. He was there was stories about he was going to come hard on them, and obviously they didn't want that to happen. And as you know, there's been various films, that the Godfather films, which came out, seem to imply that, you know, you can't do the president, but you could, you know, you can get anybody. And if an organization, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but anyone could, if they really wanted to, if they had the buy-in of certain people in power. So it's not an impossible thing, but he would have, I don't want to use a word, but he would have annoyed, in stronger words than that, a lot of organizations. So there would have been a few people out to get him.
I've always found it too difficult.
Didn't his cavalcade get adjusted at the last minute?
The cavalcade, see, I really don't buy the mafia thing. To me, it's ridiculous. The mafia is a powerful organization, but to kill a president, that's an entirely different ball game, as the Americans would say. That's an entirely different level of competency that's required. And you've taken something out of my mouth that I was going to mention, which is that the route that was chosen defied standard. What's the Secret Service? That's his. Those are the people who protect the president, isn't it? Of the American president. It defies standard Secret Service procedure because there was a sharp turn by the library, the Dallas Street, the library. There's a sharp turn where the motorcade is forced to slow down, and it's forced to slow down in front of very tall buildings.
Yeah.
And this guy was sitting in an open top.
Which is
and it's a look, man, that from every single decision that was made, that you just don't do that. It just defies standard logic that these things were well known. You didn't do that. And I believe that you're right in saying that the route was changed. And that can only happen at government level.
Yeah.
And I don't think the mafia had that kind of power.
Can you not believe that certain individuals are in senior government as well could be not at the influence of the mafia? I mean, if you think about it, there are many, many people in high office that are, you know, in cahoots and been bought out.
You'd have to be part of the Secret Service, and those guys are vetted to the nth degree, to the point where I can't believe that.
Yeah, all the money is put in, and
CIA, the people like that would have had to be involved. I mean, it's a hard sell, man. And then because shooting the president is one thing. I believe the mafia could shoot the president. Well, given an opportunity, I don't think they can set up the opportunity on their own. But getting away with it is the important thing. But I think that's the important thing.
But Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. And he was killed by Ruby, 2 days later. And that he was a mafia. We knew he was a mafia. Now, was this all a cover-up to steer people's thoughts to the mafia and try and implicate the mafia?
Lee Harvey Oswald had information. I think Lee Harvey Oswald could have said things which would have pointed fingers somewhere else.
Yeah.
I think he was a patsy and he realized it.
Yeah. Because he did say that, didn't he? In after he was arrested, he actually said, "I'm an innocent person. I'm a patty here." He actually said it in an interview, I believe, where he went on to say that I'm not involved in this, and that's when he was later killed. So you're right. I think he could have said something or implicated the direction of travel so that more questions would have been asked and made people uncomfortable. So it's quite possible that the Ruby who was used, because obviously he was dying of cancer, he could have been promised many, many things. Obviously, we're speculating because with Ruby's background, we don't know that much about. It was just that he had cancer, and he knew he was on his last legs anyway.
Yep.
So he decided to do this to shut up Oswald, but stop Lee Harvey Oswald from speaking and implicating others in places that didn't want to be implicated, so to speak.
Wouldn't you love to be on that grassy knoll? Wouldn't you love to be able to time travel, to go back onto that grassy knoll and to see what really happened?
Wow.
Because for those who don't know, the shot that I'm talking about, the shot that came from the front, that apparently came from what the Americans call a grassy knoll, which is little hillock, I suppose.
Yeah.
And there were some witnesses, one particular woman who remembered seeing someone she thought was a police officer, was dressed as a police officer. And the Oliver Stone film goes into it in some detail, and it's quite interesting stuff. But again, it's all speculation.
Yeah. Also, what annoyed me about the Warren Commission, that was supposed to be an independent commission set up, totally independent from all the establishments, to further look at it and check witnesses directly. They actually use the FBI and CIA operatives. So it's like, well, hold on. You're getting the answers from the very people they want to exclude.
We suspect, yes.
Yeah, well, I didn't suspect. They want to exclude them to make sure it was a proper investigation and independent from the current authorities, because at that point, they did have question marks on whether those two organizations did have any involvement. Because, as you rightly say, if anyone could have pulled off something like this, either of those two organizations would have likely have been in the know. If not, then it's a big failing on both of their parts. So logic seems to dictate that somebody in either of those organizations would have had some idea that something like this were to happen, but never, if they weren't involved, would have had an idea. So did they do enough to mitigate the chances? Did they not, could they not have said, well, there's a viable threat, should we not ensure that the president's in a bulletproof, cavalcade, or the route is checked again? I mean, all these things, it just seemed a little bit, as you say, lax and not quite as good and checked as it could have been. So yeah, many mistakes could be looked at as mistakes, but they just didn't seem like mistakes.
No.
It just seemed like
a little too convenient.
Yeah, in this instance.
In this instance, I think, for me, there's one thing that I hang on to, and that's the so-called magic bullet. Since it defies logic, since it defies physics, ergo, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
Ergo, there is a conspiracy. End of story.
Yeah.
For me.
And that recording, which the video from Zapruder, that to me shows there's a fourth shot, and that could not have been Lee Harvey Oswald, as far as I'm concerned. Not on a chart. So yeah, clearly something is more afoot here, and the conclusion is that he was, something was covered up. Let's put it that way. Not saying who it was, but it wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, I think, no, actually saying that, there is evidence to show that he did fire two shots. And it was, the likelihood of it being him was right, but he didn't fire the fatal shot. So
I think that was the point that he was trying to make, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I don't think I killed the guy.
Yeah.
Because if you're shooting, you go boom, boom. You don't shoot, and then there's another boom. I'm sure your first reaction is, what? Think about it. You put yourself in his shoes. You fire your shot. Bam. I think it was 3, wasn't it? Bam, bam, bam. And then you think, oh, I missed. Then you just, as you go like, oh my goodness, I missed. Then bam. They're like, hey, I didn't shoot that.
Yeah.
and then you get scared, and then you go like, uh-oh.
Well, bad enough he was doing what he was doing, but we still don't know the reasons why, because obviously he was killed before that was properly established. But then they were trying to pin him on Cuba, KGB, all these sort of entities they were trying to look at and say, well, he visited.
Muddy the water, just throw everything in there.
They're trying to blacken his name even more and saying he was a communist sympathizer. He was they were looking for their scapegoat, and his background was tarnished even more. They're trying to find out he was indeed somebody who would have been empowered and felt the need to get rid of the president somehow. But to me, all of this doesn't stem that he had enough, gripe against the president. It just seemed more fabricated to me. This is just my opinion. It didn't sound robust enough to say, well, yeah, he had a reason. He just, they didn't find loads of stuff in his house that he just hated Kennedy for some reason. It just wasn't there, It seemed a bit of a loose pinning on him. Oh yeah, he was a communist and he went to so and so and he was implicated in that manner. To me, it doesn't sit well. So I'm like you. I believe, yes, something was covered up. Who did it? Why they did it? The reasons we don't know for sure, but there's definitely a cover up here that he was assassinated. And but not just Lee Harvey Oswald involved. What's your final point on this one before we move on to the next one? You agree?
Yep.
Cool.
Something wrong there.
Yeah, it is definitely something wrong there on that one. Okay, along a similar line, our third conspiracy is something that maybe a lot of our listeners may not actually be aware of, is the death of Pope John Paul the First.
Da, da, da.
Yeah. Tayo, do you want to give a little background as to why this is deemed a conspiracy?
This is deemed a conspiracy because of the unseemly haste. I'll go back. Mainly because of the unseemly haste with which the Pope was buried. He was laid in state for 4 days, but he was embalmed within hours of his death.
Yeah.
Now, Italian law, which maybe holds sway in the Vatican, I don't know. I'm not always able to understand where Italian law ends and Vatican law takes over. But in many cases, Italian law is by treaty, the law in the Vatican. And Italian law says you have to wait for 24 hours before you embalm anyone. And they embalmed JP1, John Paul I, just 6 hours after he died, after he was found.
That's crazy. I mean, do you want me to give a bit of background?
They didn't drain his body. They didn't drain the blood either. So he was embalmed with the blood, with his blood in situ.
Strange.
Which is a bit unusual when you are... And he wasn't autopsied.
No, you can't autopsy a pope. Apparently that is not allowed. I mean, let me give, for the benefit of our listeners who are probably listening and going, what? Is this a conspiracy? Why? What happened? Just to give them a background, in 1978, there was a pope who died. It was Pope Paul VI. Now, obviously, it's part of the customs. The cardinals had to go into the conclave in the Vatican to decide on a next pope. And the popes, the cardinals wanted to pick a pope who was less authoritarian, wanted a pope who was a bit more open and someone who was a bit more engaging with the people. And so they picked this pope, and his name was Luciani, and he was the youngest pope, one of the youngest popes ever to have been chosen. And he was referred to as the smiling pope because he engaged with his audience. He was quite happy. He was quite, he was just a lovely, lovely man. And everybody who knew him liked his friendlier style. They liked the way that he was very approachable. He was warm. He was just what the church needed somebody who was appealing and to the youth, and the youth loved him. And he was referred to as a smiling Pope because everybody engaged with him was left feeling great. And he was young. He used to ride a bike about 10 miles a day. So he was very fit and healthy. And why this is a conspiracy is because he was a pope for just 33 days. And then he died mysteriously of a heart attack. And this is where this all stems from, as Tayo has concluded, that he was then embalmed and put away, so to speak, in such a short time frame that was, out of this world, effectively. And the reason why is because the death as well, when he was found, his fingernails apparently the nuns who found him were black. He was reading a book and they were very, very black, which is akin to potential poisoning. And as Tayo said, he wasn't autopsied because in Vatican law, the Pope cannot be checked.
That I didn't know.
Yes, apparently.
And I think we have our first disagreement.
Okay.
I disagree that the reasons you gave, that he was the youngest pope, he was
He was one of the youngest.
He was cycling around, is why anybody thought there was a conspiracy. You just mean, well, yes, it was all those things, and he died, and Bob's your uncle 33 days after being elected pope. He died. That's nothing to do with why people think there's a conspiracy. They think of there's a conspiracy because of the way the Vatican handled the death. So I'm really surprised because I've watched a couple of, I was going to say several, but I think two isn't several. I've watched a couple of films about Pope John Paul I's death and everything, and people will still say that he should have been why wasn't he autopsied? And you're telling me that it's against the law, but how come nobody else has mentioned that?
Yeah.
I've never heard that been mentioned before. Everybody else has said he should have been autopsied.
Yeah, because you can't autopsy a pope.
Yeah, but why did people say so then? I mean, these are people
That's
like, CBS. Surely the what are they called now? Commercial broadcasting system in America. They're big enough to go. It's a silly thing to say because you can't autopsy a pope, but they didn't say that. And you're the only person, to be frank, Tony, you're the only person I've heard who's made the allegation.
Yeah, you can't. My understanding was that you can't do an autopsy on a pope. It's a desecration or something. And so that's why, even if there was an opportunity for him to be poisoned, and I'll go on the reasons why as well, is people are doubting that such a youngish pope and quite a fit pope
would have died. Or something? How old was he?
No. He was way younger than that. Way younger than that. He wasn't as old as that. No. And because he was quite fit and healthy, how could he have died of a heart attack that they weren't aware of? So that's part of the question. He's like, oh, that's weird, strange. And
on answers.com, are you allowed to do an autopsy on a pope? It says yes, you can if you have permission from the Vatican.
Yes, but they don't give. Yeah, I'm reading Catholics this now that says autopsies are considered a desecration of the body and thus illegal in Vatican law. So they would have to allow it, special case, if they chose to, but they decided not to. Which to me,
so they could have chosen to. So this is where the suspicion starts. It's like, well, if he died this quickly and unexpectedly, and of course reasons you are about to mention, which is what makes it a little bit more suspect than it would have been.
Yeah.
Then why did you not just grant permission, just put everybody's mind at rest?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, but there was a book written in the after his death by a British writer called David Yallop, and it was a book called In God's Name. And this suggested that he'd been murdered.
Well, the guy had to sell his book. Come on.
Well, he's going to say that. But part of the reasons were because also as well, of the ones you stated, that he wasn't allowed to have an autopsy. Also, some of the cardinals realized that what he was trying to do, he was trying to, and he actually said this during his early days of being voted in as the Pope. He said that the church was too rich. And he said some of the money that the Vatican Bank, and for our listeners who might be surprised out there, yes, there's a Vatican Bank. He said some of that money should be dispersed amongst the populations where it's needed for the poor. And he wanted to actively reduce the funds in the church to make sure more of it was given out. Now, the Vatican Bank is corrupt. There's been arguments about it on many occasions. And in his book, Yallop pointed out that they had a bearing on this. They did not want to allow the funds in the Vatican Bank to be dispersed amongst the poor, clearly, because he seemed to link that the bank had some links to mafia, which could be possible, and so forth. The order was given that you can't allow this money to go to the poor because the bank have an influence on it. The mafia have an influence on the Vatican Bank, and so doing, they chose to get rid of the Pope so that this would not happen. And this is why his papacy, which is obviously very, very short and mysterious for someone who was relatively healthy, was frowned upon and looked at and thought, well, how? It just doesn't make sense. What's your view?
Well, I'm of the view that the man had a heart attack. That's the best that I can come up with at this time. He had a heart attack and he died around 4 a.m. Now, this isn't coming to Tyre because I've thought about it a great deal, because I've done a lot of research on it. To be honest with you, it comes because I've watched a couple of movies and their argument is convincing to me. Okay. He had chest pains the day before, and they did not call the doctors. Now, according to one film, which flat out says, this is all speculation, we can't prove anything, they believe that the Pope died sometime between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning of a massive heart attack, probably out of bed and on the ground.
Apparently they know that the nuns will stipulate they found him in the bed with a book.
I was about to tell you all that.
Yeah, sorry.
And in speculation, I underlined it 2-3 times.
Yeah.
The filmmakers say, no, we're speculating, we don't know for sure. But there's a reason why, and I'll get to it. So they believe the Pope died on the floor outside of bed. They believe that around 4 a.m., he was discovered by one of his secretaries who came in and found him dead on the ground. That secretary called a second secretary, and together they put the Pope's body into the bed and they set him up to look as if he had died with his glasses on and reading a book in a pious fashion and looking peaceful, where they left him in that pose for the nuns to find in the morning.
Is there evidence of this?
No. But there's no evidence, but there's one thing, is that the medical doctors that they spoke to said, if you die of a heart attack, you will not be found reclining in bed with a book against your chest, your glasses on, and seemingly because somebody said he had a smile on his face. He said, you can be posed like that, but that's not the natural way to die of a heart attack. Or even worse, because the Pope was suspected by the conspiracy theorists, was suspected of dying of digitalis, which you mentioned he had blackened fingers. The thing about it is that digitalis is actually a very painful way to go.
Mm.
and there would have been agony etched onto his face. So they dismissed the digitalis thing straight away. And they say it takes quite a lot. I think they were talking about 10 mgs of digitalis to kill you.
Right.
And they were saying you have to take it all at once. You couldn't be sipping it, because if you started sipping a drink that had digitalis in it, halfway through you start feeling extremely unwell.
Mm.
And they point out that the Pope had right next to his bed, he had a panic button, and he never triggered the panic button. So whatever happened quickly and catastrophically.
Mm. Can I just go back on a
please
point you
jump
said?
in. Yeah.
Yes, you said that somebody, if they have a heart attack, would not be in an upright position and would not be, they would be falling forward or something like that. No, that's not true. This is a story that I know directly. A friend of mine's father had a heart attack while sat in a chair, and he didn't move forward. He didn't do anything. He just died. 1 minute he was talking and he was fine. And literally within just a handful of minutes, he was stationary, hadn't moved from his spot. He'd had a heart attack, massive heart attack, and he was still upright in the chair. So not upright, like it was one of those chairs that's slightly leaning back. So having a heart attack does not mean you will move forward, back, or ever. It's your heart stopping. And
I think
if it's a sudden, it stops you. You can't move.
I think the thing that was highlighted was reclining with a book in his hands. And the doctors said, there were two of them, I think, the doctors said the hands would relax upon the point of death and the book would fall out. Now, there's no grip in the dead man's hands.
That's actually not true either. I'm surprised by that. I'm actually surprised by that, because the muscles no longer move, and whatever the muscles were holding on to will remain in that position. They don't move.
Takes energy to hold. Hold on. That takes energy to hold.
No, the position remains the same. It depends on how heavily
What do you mean by no? I said it takes energy to hold the book, and you're saying no.
You say, how was the book up in the air, or was it leaning on the bed?
Just think about somebody reading with his hands.
Yeah.
You're lying in bed and you're reading a book. The book is not going to be lying down. It's going to be upright somehow. Your hands are keeping it upright, which requires energy. Once the energy is gone, it can't possibly stay upright. It has to fall out.
Yeah, but fall down onto the bed flat. How would we know where the book was? It wasn't in his hands.
Because the nun said that he was found with his books in his hands.
No, that's not what I read. Oh. I read that the nun found the book on the bed, not in his hands, on the bed. So, yeah, someone has taken that and said in his hands, when it's just a tight word, on the bed, near his hands. So slightly different explanation, and someone has recounted it, to make the story a little bit stronger, when the article I saw, which seems to purport coming from the nuns who were asked this, who found him, said they found the book on the bed. They had no mention that he was gripping it, holding it, or anything like that. The Pope's skin was whole and his nails were dark, surprisingly dark. That was a word that they use, surprisingly dark.
I don't know why that would be surprisingly dark, because wouldn't that just be a normal part of having a heart attack?
Possibly. I'd like to read up on that. If
blood doesn't move around, it pools in various places, and one of those various places being your fingernails and toenails, your extremities, basically, and your extremities therefore turn dark. So I don't know why that would be an issue. Possibly. It seems that you and I have both got a lot of issues with this particular story.
Yeah. I mean,
digitalis wasn't. So anyway, an experiment. The film I watched, they carried out an experiment. You embalm a body to 20 to 25% embalming fluid, and using equipment available in 1978, they found that the embalming fluid did not hide digitalis if it was in 25% solution. It only hid digitalis in 90% solution. So the body of the Pope's body would have revealed digitalis if it had been investigated.
Okay.
And whoever did the embalming would have known that. And the mere fact that he wasn't embalmed to 90% is sort of evidence that they weren't trying to hide anything. They just think that the excuse given by the Vatican at the time was that it was going to be warm. And as he was going to be lying, the Pope's body was going to be lying in state for 4 days. They just didn't want anything, they don't want the Pope's body going into putrefaction, which would have been unpleasant for everyone. So they embalmed him. And as I sometimes say, I tend to believe in incompetence over malice.
Well, indeed, that is the likely outcome. Let's be honest. I mean, the evidence here seems to point that he had simply a heart attack, but the steps that followed are the bits that are strange. It's like, why? But then again, there was also reason. He did want to change the way the things within the church were operating. Correct. So he did want to stir it up.
Which I didn't even understand. I didn't even hear. I heard, because we've heard different things, so it may depend on which sources one is using.
Yeah.
I heard he wanted to introduce the birth control pill, and he wanted to look into the finances of the Vatican, because apparently a lot of hanky-panky had been going on in the Vatican bank.
Yeah.
And he wanted to get to the bottom of it.
One.
And I believe that afterwards, somebody did hang himself from a bridge in Rome. I've got a faint memory of this. Some banker hung himself from a bridge, but he did so in a manner which meant it couldn't have been suicide. It was meant to look like suicide. Was there a note found? But in looking at the suicide, I was like, well, he'd have needed to have done this and done that, and it's just not possible.
Yeah.
So he looked like he'd been knocked off. And then there was a big scandal, and some people went to prison, didn't they? So I don't know. And then because John Paul II, his successor, he too looked into the finances of the Vatican.
Yeah, but not to the same degree.
And when there are questions about his death also.
I'm not sure about that. But we are getting close to the end of the show. Actually, we've only managed 3 conspiracies today, so we have got several more to discuss on subsequent shows. So we'll keep those under wraps for you for another time. But Tayo, on this final one about the Pope, what's your view? Do you think he was murdered, or was it just strange circumstances that just can't really be explained?
To be honest, I'm going to have to sit on the fence on this one. I tend, if I was going to be pushed off the fence one way or another by force, I'd fall towards incompetence, but I'd be uncomfortable. The fact that he was investigating fraud, a massive fraud, made it a very suspect thing that he died, and his death was handled quite the way it was.
Yeah. That is the problem. That is the problem. He wanted to change things, and obviously some people didn't like the changes he was looking into. But so there's reasons for him not to be there, and obviously some people are always going to be upset. And because of the way that the Vatican works and Vatican law regarding autopsy, there is a possibility that he could have been bumped off, because I believe he was in his mid-60s and he was very fit. So this is the thing that does throw questions, whether he was poisoned. That again, there's no evidence for that, so we have to say no. But the steps after his death, as you've already said, are strange. They're not for normal process that's been done. In fact, even for the Pope who preceded him, he was only done 33 days before. So it wasn't like they hadn't done it, but they did it completely differently. So why did they not adopt the same thing for the first Pope that passed away, and then 33 days later they decided to do something completely different, which is rather strange. Pope Paul VI. He died, just like I said, less than a month before. So they didn't do the same for him. They didn't embalm him immediately on his passing. So why change the way that they deal with the death of a pope over such a short time frame? Do you see what I mean? That again also raises a number of questions. So there
from
we
the
have
2009 online magazine, crisismagazine.com, I would like to read this out. It's a little longish. I'll try to hurry it up. Yallop, some guy who wrote a book.
Yeah, he's the guy that wrote the book, yeah.
Glorifies John Paul as a brilliant, strong-willed, decisive campaigner for justice, a saintly crusader. He praises Luciani's literary skill and breadth of culture, telling us at least 3 times that he'd read Mark Twain.
Wow.
Yallop's Pope is a liberal reformer, even a friend of Hans Kung, who was on the verge of reversing the church's position on contraception and cleaning up the Vatican Bank.
Yeah.
Not to mention flushing Masonic cardinals out of the Vatican.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this image is rejected by Cornwall sources, both by hostile clerical observers and fond intimates. To the Roman clergy, John Paul was a gauche and incompetent figure of fun. An Australian reporter who tried writing his biography summed him up as an extremely anxious, nervous little man. His secretaries, Reverend Diego Lorenzi and Reverend John McGee, both describe a terminally meek man. McGee tells a pathetic anecdote about finding John Paul huddled in a fetal position on his bed, frantically praying for the rosary because he had dropped some papers off his roof garden. So we have 2 very different outlooks there on John Paul I. Goodness alone knows which one is the truth. And there I'll leave it.
Okay. Thank you for that wonderful conclusion. And we, unfortunately, have reached the end of the show for another week. Tune in next time.